Okay, welcome back to another CSS Grid tutorial. I'm going through some of the basic parts of the CSS Grid specification for layout. In this video I'm going to talk to you about placing items on a grid layout. So in the previous video, the introduction, I talked about how to set up the columns and the rows and do the grid gap and to place your items onto a grid. In this one I'm going to tell you how to go about taking each individual item and deciding where it's actually placed on the grid. So there are two ways to do it. One is to just allow the grid to auto flow based on the HTML here. So it's going to put the first item in the first space, it's going to put the second item in the second cell, I guess is what we call it, and the third, and so on, and it's going to auto flow them this way in rows. And then, you know, once it finishes out, I have this set for 3 columns, so once it finishes out that 3 columns, it goes down to the second row, fills that out, etc., etc. I have a third row set here too with nothing in it, but I want it to catch the overflow, which it's going to in just a moment. So just looking at this, we have a grid wrapper, which is this red part. That's our actual display grid, and then all the child elements are child elements of this grid wrapper. So we've had the grid wrapper set to display grid. We have our columns repeating, 3 across, and they're evenly spaced. So one fraction is when you do the 1FR, that means they're all evenly spaced. We have the 3 different rows. The first row is 300 pixels tall, the second is 200, and the third is also 200. So we have a little bit of differentiation there. The grid gap on the inside is 2 rem, so 30, I don't know, probably 32 pixels. And then the background is red, just so that you could see the lines. That's what I wanted you to be able to see on here, but we could just as easily take that off, and then we would have our grid still there. And then I put a little padding because if you take it off, it's butted up against the edges like this. So I just put some padding on the actual wrapper itself so that we could see all these lines. These lines are what I want you they're called tracks, and I want you to be able to see the grid lines. Our grid item is by default white, and then I made each individual item, you know, the odd ones, different colors. I could have done this any number of ways. I could have done in-child types of declarations, but I want to show you how you can tag each one, and you can just change the positioning of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this one first, and we're going to place this in specific places and taking up specific parts of the grid, and you'll see the grid auto flow around the specific one. So the way that we do that is we go to the actual item level, not to the grid level, but to the grid item, and we type in grid. We have two commands. We can say grid column, and then we can also say grid row. So we can determine both how many columns it takes up and how many rows it takes up. So the first one we'll look at is the grid column, and the way that we can declare this is you can do a couple of different things. You can, I'm going to show you the shorthand, but I'll show you the longhand too. So we have a grid column start, and if we want it in the upper left hand corner, then we would say 1. And the reason we get 1 is because this track here is number 1. So when you're talking about columns, you're talking about vertical. So grid column 1, this is track 2 or line 2, and this is track 3 or line 3, and this is track 4 or line 4. They're also named start and end. You can actually give these lines names if you wanted to. So if you were doing a large layout and you wanted to specify from this line to this line is called something specific, like masthead or header or something like that, you can actually name up here, you can name the lines. So that's a pretty cool thing, and as you get into more complex layouts, that becomes really handy. For a simple basic layout like this, we can just use the column start and column end. So what we do is we can also do a grid column end, and let's just do the basic one. The basic one that it's at right now by default is 2. So it starts at line line 1, grid column line 1, and it goes to grid column line 2. That's exactly what we have by default. Sorry. So that's no big deal. But what if we do line 3? So what it's done is it's starting at grid column line 1, and then it's taking up all the space past line 2 to line 3. You can do the same thing to all the way to the end to line 4, and then it takes up all the space. Okay, so it's starting at grid column line 1, and it's going all the way to line 4. If this were a larger grid going out farther, then there would still be items auto-flowing. You can see our items are still auto-flowing. It's just that this one is taking up more space. There is a shorthand, and the way that we do that is we say grid column, and then you start with the first where you want it to start, and then you give it a /, and then you give it whatever the line is that you want it to end at. So in your column, we want our column to start at grid column 1 and finish at grid column 2, and nobody can stop it from doing that. If we put 3, it takes up 2 spaces. If we put 4, it takes up the space here. If you want to, you can also do this. Let's say we want it to span 1 column, and then 2, and then it can span 3 columns. Or if you wanted to go all the way across the page, you can say span all, and then it'll just span all of the columns across the page. We can also do for spanning all the way across the page, another shorthand is to say 1 and / and then -1, and that will actually, you can see it didn't do that strange thing that happened with item number 5 when we did span all. So this is the shorthand if you want one of your grid items to take up the entire space for the grid from the starting line all the way to the end line. You would say 1 and -1. Okay, so that is grid column. So let's just do for now, let's just do span 2. I like this because it's easier for me to understand. I know that it's starting at line number 1 and it's spanning two cells, so it's taking up 2 cells. This is a terminology that makes sense to me. Sometimes I get a little thrown off by the on a larger grid or a more complex grid, you start thinking about, okay, well, this is starting at number 3 and this one's starting at number 6, and it gets a little bit funky to understand in my head. So I like the span, being able to span the different things. And then the other thing that we can do is we can say grid, and it's the same thing, grid row start or grid column start, and then you can decide where, the grid row start, grid row end. So you can decide where the starting line is. So this is grid row 1, line 1, line 2, line 3, and then line 4. So we can decide where it starts. We could say 1, and then we can go down to 2. So it starts at 1 and goes down to 2, and it starts at 1 and it takes up 2 spaces. So this is exactly our default. If we wanted to do 1 to 3, you can see that it's taking up from this line, which is grid row line 1. This is grid row line 2. It's going through that to line 3. Okay. If you wanted to do all the way to line 4, you could do that as well, and then all of a sudden you have these items are overflowing. These are in a strange place because I only have it set for 3 rows. I believe if this were if this were auto, Let's see what that does. Okay, so it doesn't give any definition in shape because there's nothing inside of here. But you could set your grid template rows to just kind of automatically fill in. And so if each of your items had an actual size or shape or some content, it would all just kind of flow in together. Alright, so let's just leave it like that. And then I think you could get rid of that if we use the 1/-1, and we'll try that. So I like the shorthand of just saying grid row. We'll start at 1, and again you can use things like span 2, and then it spans across 2 columns, 2 rows, you can see here, and then everything just kind of auto fills in behind it. You could do span all, which again gives us our funky little thing going on down here, but it does span all of the rows. And then you can do the -1, which still gives us a little funky, because it has to find a place to put these. You know, you're pushing everything around, but there's no actual space for these to go. So it has to push them somewhere. So it's just pushing them down. So there, you can tell there's some, you need to think about your grid. You need to think about how the items on the grid are going to be flowing around one another. So that, you know, this one here, this works, right? This is a grid pattern that works. This could be like a nice little featured something, and then these are smaller somethings around it. But you just have to kind of play with it and see how the grid is going to work in the end, because you need to start matching your grid to what you have. So you got to think a lot more like a designer and think about how these grid items are going to flow around one another. Okay, so let's go down to the grid item 3. That's this pink one here. And let's say we want the grid column to be we want it to be, well, we want it to start here, and we want it to take up 2 spaces down here. So we need to start it at grid column track 1, and we need it to end at grid column track 1, 2, 3, and we need it to end at grid column 4, right? So we say 3 and then 4. You don't necessarily have to declare that, I don't think, because it's already taking up that space. But what we really want to do is we want it to take up 2 rows, right? So we want to do grid row, and then we would say it's grid row 1, grid row 2 to grid row 4, right? So line 2 to line 4. It's going to take up that space, and we're having another funky thing here, so let's just add another row just so it looks pretty. There we go. So we add another row. So we have 4 declared rows, 1, 2, 3, 4. We could also do something like this where we say repeat 4 and then they just take up 1 fraction each. Maybe auto? No. Let's just go ahead and make them 200 pixels. Okay, so that's what we had before. So each of these rows is 200 pixels tall. You can see that they're evenly spaced, and we have 4 rows, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. The grid is a little bit more difficult because you have to think both conceptually and you have to think in very concrete ways too. So when you're dealing with elements on the page, it's you should start with something that's concrete and that you can look to and you can begin to draw, even if it's just a sketch of a grid on a piece of paper. If you have a Photoshop comp, or if you have some sort of Illustrator comp of what you want the grid or the page to look like, it can get a little bit difficult to see everything if you don't have some sort of visual layout of the grid to go by whenever you're doing the code for this. So you can see here, so it takes up that amount of space there. Let's do let's do line 5 here, or grid item 5, I'm sorry. So we're going to say grid column, and then this one starts where it starts at track 1, track 2, right? So track 2, and I want it to just be 1. Like, actually I don't want that. I want it to go from 1 to 3. So let's try that. So since it doesn't have enough space here, it automatically pulls down to the next line where it does have enough space. So it's going to go grid line 1 to grid line 3, right? So track 1, track 2, track 3. And then where it is now with the grid row is fine with me. We can make that declaration by saying grid row 3, which when we do grid row 3, you can see that it pulls it up and it absolutely puts it on grid row 3. So this is grid row 1, 2, and 3. And the implied thing is that it goes from track 3 to track 4. Now since we've added another line, we have also grid track 5, right? So we haven't expanded it across, but we have expanded it vertically. So right now, when you declare it to be on grid row 3, you're declaring it to be on this row, and it pushes everything else down. It flows everything else down. So we could say just 3 to 4 if we wanted to, which is the default. You could also say 3 to 5, which has some interesting implications, and we would need to add another row here. So then you're just kind of building it out. And then that would have an interesting implication of pushing everything around. But you can see here that we have actually taken everything out of the flow, right? So when you give certain things a declaration of where they're going to be, everything else flows around it. So grid item 4 should be over here. It should come down, and grid item 4 should be here. But because we've told this one you are going to take up all this space, then we have not told this one to take up any space. It's just auto flowing. Then it gets pushed to the next available space in this one as well. So you can actually rearrange your elements on the grid even though we've never touched anything in the HTML. Now this is a really important part about CSS Grid, is it allows us to write really good and semantic HTML. So if a person had an accessibility browser and they were going through this, they would see item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but visually you don't have to present everything as top left is item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can present the items in a different order than what you're presenting them in the HTML. So there's a total separation of your markup and your grid. Now this does not happen if you're using a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation. Those have to be in the order that they're going to be for the most part in the HTML. Now you have some options to kind of flip them or you can offset them and things like that, but as far as being able to reflow everything around and still keep your HTML intact, that is not possible to my knowledge in Bootstrap. And this is what makes Grid so powerful. You can see how this layout here could work as a type of mosaic layout for portfolio pieces or something like that, where you wanted to highlight or you wanted to feature something, but you want everything else to kind of flow around it, but you want to give that highlight a specific size or place on the grid. So it just gives you a lot of control, and this is all of the HTML, I mean the CSS that it requires. There's no need to download all of the backlog of CSS that you have to download for Bootstrap. And I understand that they try to keep it as small as possible, but still, that's 50 kilobytes or 100 kilobytes or whatever it is that you don't have to download. And then you also don't have to go through and like pick out all of the column structures and the responsive structures and stuff like that. So this actually is a responsive grid. I can make it a lot more responsive than this, but even as it is, this grid does what it's supposed to do, you know. So that is placing items. Just remember that grid column and grid row are the way that you place items on the page. Now I'm going to show you one last little part of it, and that is to say, let's say grid item 4. I hinted at this already, but you can just use round numbers here. So let's just do number 4, and we'll say I don't want it to be pink, I want it to be yellow. Okay. And then what we're going to do with grid item 4 is we're going to put it on row 4. Now I can specify where it needs to go. It was already there, but I can also put it on row 5. So I can put it down here where it takes up its own row. So I don't have to assume, I don't have to put the different tracks on here. I don't have to say it goes from here to here. I can just say you're going to be on row 4. You're going to be in column 1. So I could say that, right? Column 1. So now it's in column 1 on row 4, and it's taking up the space that it takes. I could say, I can move it around. I could say you're going to be in column 2, and then it moves over to column 2. I can say you're going to be in column 3, and it moves to column 3. You could say column 4, and it creates a new column. You see, that's a bad idea. But we can say you're going to be in column here 1, and you're going to take up all of the space on this row from the first track to the very last track. It's almost like you're creating an infinite, like it's wrapping around in a circle if you pictured it in 3 dimensions. But it's going from grid track 1 to infinity, essentially to the very end of the whole thing. So you can see we push this one down to its own specific row, which takes this one, and it needs a place to go because we haven't given it any sort of declaration. It's just going to flow into the empty space because we took it out of there, and now it flows in there. So it's like a vacuum. So you're removing something, but there's too much pressure. It has to push something into that vacuum somewhere. Okay, unless you fill this space. So if I filled the space with item 3, and I said grid row 2 to 5, then it's going to push that one down to the next available space, which is the next row, and then we would just create a new row, and then you have your box filling its space. Item 3 would be taking up more space. Item 2 still has no declaration, so it's filling the space that's left between item 1 and item 3, and that's this little space up here. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of the way that things flow and the way that you can specifically position items on the grid. I have an introductory video to CSS Grid. I encourage you to watch that. Also, if you have any questions about Grid, the 2 main women who are pushing for this, the developers, are Rachel Andrews and Jen Simmons. So if you look up their names, they're all over Grid. You can follow them on Twitter. They each have different websites that you can go to. There's also a really great guide to CSS Grid that I use all the time as a reference on CSS-Tricks. So if you just look up CSS Grid guide, it'll probably come up pretty soon, but it's on CSS-Tricks.com, and it's a really handy once you learn the terminology to see how everything fits both at the container level and at the individual item level, and it's just a good reference. If you have any comments about the video or any sort of question about Grid or what I'm talking about in this video, please leave a comment. I'm pretty good at getting to them at this point, so I just want you to leave them, and I want you to learn Grid, because this is the future of laying out websites using CSS. And if you like it, if you like some other videos, please subscribe. I'm still putting videos out, and you'll get notified when new ones come out. So click subscribe, click the thumbs up button. That really helps with me being able to be discovered just in the natural search, and I appreciate it. So if you liked it, then like it. Alright, thanks. And I will I'll see you next time.